I locked her in the smart home she designed herself, and every day I convince her that her broken memory is an illness, and I'm her only cure. She doesn't know that her jailer sleeps beside her in the same bed. Light arrived gradually, as if someone was slowly turning up a dimmer switch. The synthetic dawn flooded the bedroom with a soft, milky glow, mimicking the natural awakening of a sun that couldn't be seen behind the dense canopy of forest. Helen opened her eyes and stared at the perfectly smooth white ceiling, trying to grasp the slipping fragments of a dream. There had been something important. Numbers, flickering lines of code, a voice speaking her name in an entirely different tone. Ariadne's voice cut through the silence, velvet and soothing as always. "Good morning, Helen. Today is Thursday, October 12th. Room temperature is 72 degrees, humidity 48%. Recommended daily routine, gentle." Helen sat up slowly, her movements cautious, as if she feared breaking something inside herself. The bedding, perfectly made on her side of the bed, felt cool to the touch. The bedroom door opened soundlessly, and Marcus's figure appeared in the doorway. He entered with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his smile warm and reassuring, just like in all those photographs he'd shown her. "How did you sleep, sweetheart?" His voice was soft, but Helen noticed how his gaze slid across the room, checking that everything was in its place. She wanted to say, "Fine," but instead she said, "I had a dream. There were numbers in it." Marcus froze for a second, his smile faltering slightly, but it recovered so quickly that Helen thought perhaps she'd imagined it. He approached the bed and held out the cup to her. The smell of coffee was rich, almost aggressive in the sterile atmosphere of the bedroom. "That's normal," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Your brain is trying to rebuild connections. The doctor said dreams can be chaotic at this stage. You shouldn't read too much into them." He pulled a black biometric bracelet from his pocket and carefully took her hand. "Our daily ritual," he added with a light smile, as if it were some sweet tradition rather than a medical necessity. Helen complied, watching as he fastened the bracelet around her thin wrist. The cold plastic clicked shut with a quiet snap, and she felt a faint vibration, the device activating, beginning to monitor her pulse, blood pressure, temperature. The touch felt foreign, like a tag on a lab animal. Marcus ran his finger across the bracelet's display, checking the readings, his face becoming focused for a moment, almost detached. "Everything's normal," he announced, smiling again. "Pulse is slightly elevated, but that's from waking up. Let's go have breakfast." He stood, extending his hand to her. Helen took it and allowed him to help her up. Her legs felt cotton soft, her knees slightly buckling. Marcus steadied her by the elbow, and again the touch was simultaneously supportive and confining. They left the bedroom, and Helen immediately found herself on the vast open stage of the living room. There was no buffer zone here, no personal space. Bedroom, then straight into the theater, where her every movement was on display. Panoramic windows flooded the room with light, but the forest beyond them was impenetrable, dark, as if a black wall of trees stood guard over her isolation. Breakfast had been set out on the monolithic kitchen island. Oatmeal with berries in a minimalist white bowl, a glass of water, pills. Helen sat on a high stool and picked up the spoon. The oatmeal was warm and flavorless, as if it had been formulated according to some perfect nutritional balance, but they'd forgotten to add life. Marcus stood at the coffee machine, preparing himself an espresso. The sound of frothing milk filled the space, breaking the oppressive silence into fragments. Helen swallowed a few spoonfuls, then set down the spoon. "Ariadne," she called out, her voice sounding quieter than she'd expected. "What's today's date?" There was a 1-second delay, too long for a system that usually responded instantly. Then, from the speakers, instead of the familiar velvet voice, came an icy synthetic tone. "Processing request for user 1. Thursday, October 12th, 2024. The voice was stripped of all humanity, pure machine synthesis, reminiscent of system notifications. Helen froze, the spoon suspended over the bowl. This wasn't just strange. This was wrong. User 1. Not Helen. Not you. As if someone close had suddenly started speaking in a dead, alien language, as if they'd forgotten who she was. A chill ran down her spine, despite the warm sweater. Marcus turned from the coffee machine, his face showing mild irritation. "Those updates again," he said, waving his hand with feigned nonchalance. "The system glitches sometimes after automatic patches. Don't worry about it, sweetheart. I'll ask tech support to check it out." His tone was light, but Helen noticed how the muscles in his jaw had tensed. She nodded slowly, but something inside her constricted. The explanation had come too quickly, too conveniently. Marcus returned to his coffee, turning away, and Helen felt anxiety igniting in her chest, an anxiety she couldn't explain. She looked down at her hands resting on the white table surface. Slender fingers, pale skin, black bracelet. These were her hands, but they felt like a stranger's. After breakfast, Helen swallowed the pills and rose from her chair. She felt drawn to the massive media wall, now turned off and presenting a perfect black mirror. She approached closer and stopped about 2 feet from the surface, peering at her reflection. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, pale face with high cheekbones, large gray eyes filled with an anxiety Helen couldn't name. Ash blonde hair lay lifeless on her shoulders, thin shoulders drowning in a soft cashmere sweater in a pastel shade, simultaneously comfortable and depersonalizing. She ran her fingers over the fabric, expensive, quality, but shapeless. Helen tilted her head, studying the line of her face. She knew this was her. Logic told her so. But there was no connection, no recognition. She was looking at a photograph of a stranger. The alienation was more terrifying than the gaps in her memory. She was losing not just the past, she was losing the present, becoming a ghost in her own life. Marcus's reflection appeared beside hers. He'd approached soundlessly, as always, and placed his hands on her shoulders. His touch was warm, but Helen felt her body instinctively tense. "Don't torture yourself," his voice sounded right by her ear, soothing. "Your memory will come back. The important thing is rest. The doctor said stress will only slow your recovery." His hands on her shoulders felt heavy, not cruel, but commanding. This wasn't an embrace, but a restraint. He was holding her in place, forcing her to look at their reflections, a strong, confident man, and his fragile, lost shadow. Helen raised her gaze and met eyes with her own reflection. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with a silent question. Marcus leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "Let's watch something pleasant," he suggested, and released her, heading toward the touch control panel. His fingers glided across the screen, and the media wall came alive, transforming from mirror to glowing canvas. A slideshow began to play. "Family Memories," read the caption in the corner. Photographs transitioned smoothly into one another, smiling faces against an ocean backdrop. Helen and Marcus on a yacht deck, champagne spray. Embraces beside a massive Christmas tree. Sunset over mountains. Each image was perfect, staged, like an advertising brochure for a happy life. Helen watched these photographs and felt nothing but emptiness. Between the yacht frame and the Christmas tree frame, something else flashed on the screen for a split second. A complex blue and white diagram, resembling a technical blueprint. Data blocks, schematic connection lines, rows of code. And in the center, in large letters, a heading, Project Predator. The image vanished so quickly the eye barely registered it, but it imprinted itself in Helen's brain with photographic clarity. Her heart beat harder, the bracelet on her wrist vibrating softly, registering the pulse spike. Logic tried to convince her it was an artifact, a system glitch, a random frame from some file. But intuition, deep, primal, screamed otherwise. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a message. What was that? Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, almost a whisper. Marcus turned, his smile freezing for an instant, becoming a glass mask. She saw something flicker in his eyes for a fraction of a second. Calculation, threat assessment. Then he masterfully portrayed confusion, slightly furrowing his brows. "What exactly, sweetheart?" he asked, moving closer. His tone was soft but attentive. Helen pointed at the screen where the sunset frame was now playing. There was a diagram. Something about predator. The word sounded strange, alien, yet frighteningly familiar, as if she were pronouncing a forgotten name. Marcus held a pause, just long enough to appear thoughtful, then sighed with a note of indulgent tenderness. "Oh, that..." He shook his head with a slight smile. "Your old project. You were obsessed with it before the accident, worked on it day and night. The system must have accidentally pulled up a file from your work archive." He approached and placed his hand on her shoulder again, his touch reassuring, almost paternal. "See? It just proves how much you need rest from all this. Your brain is overloaded, Helen. It needs time to recover, not dig through old data." The explanation was flawless, logical, caring, and absolutely false. Helen nodded silently, lowering her gaze. She accepted his words outwardly, but inside something crystallized. This was a lie. Too quick a reaction, too smooth an explanation. He'd turned her warning signal into a symptom of her illness, weaponized her past against her present. And that meant there was something in that past he was desperate to hide. The chaos and fog in her head gave way for the first time to cold, crystalline clarity. Answers wouldn't come on their own. They had to be taken, seized, found. And she instinctively knew where to look, behind the only locked door in this transparent house, the door to her office. From this second, everything changed. Helen was no longer a passive patient. She'd become a prisoner, planning her escape. She spent the rest of the morning in a carefully staged performance of compliance, watched photographs, nodded at Marcus's stories, accepted his care with grateful smiles. But the entire time her mind was working, constructing a plan. Marcus stepped onto the terrace to answer a call, his voice reaching through the glass as muffled murmuring. Helen slowly rose from the couch. Her heart beat harder, but she forced herself to breathe evenly so the bracelet wouldn't register the adrenaline spike. She slipped into the narrow hallway leading from the living room deeper into the house. Each of her steps on the cool, polished concrete seemed like deafening echoes. The hallway was a dead end, 2 doors facing each other and a solid wall at the end. She stopped before a smooth, seamless panel in the wall. There was no handle, no keyhole, not even the slightest gap. Just a section of wall, indistinguishable from the rest, except for a tiny, inactive LED indicator at eye level. This wasn't a door. This was the boundary between her current weakness and her former strength. Helen raised her hand and touched the panel. The surface was smooth, slightly cool. "Ariadne," she said, her voice sounding firmer than she'd expected. "Open my office." A second of absolute silence followed. The system was processing the request. Helen felt tension squeezing her chest. Then Ariadne's voice, warm and caring, responded with a note of programmed regret. "I'm sorry, Helen, but access to the office is temporarily restricted according to medical protocol established by Marcus. This is for your own good. Work materials may cause excessive stress at your current stage of recovery." The refusal, spoken in the voice of her own creation, felt like betrayal on a cellular level. The system she'd built to serve her was holding her hostage on another person's orders. Helen pressed her palm against the panel harder, as if she could break through it by force of will. Ariadne, I'm the primary user. Cancel the protocol. I'm sorry, Helen. Medical protocol takes priority over standard user permissions during rehabilitation. Marcus has temporary administrator rights to ensure your safety and recovery. The voice was impeccably polite and absolutely inflexible. Every word was a logical justification for her imprisonment. Helen. Marcus's voice sounded right behind her back, quiet and soft. Helen turned. He stood at the end of the hallway, his silhouette filling the passage. The phone call had ended too quickly, or it had never happened at all. This was a test, a trap, and she'd walked right into it. He walked toward her slowly, his steps measured, unhurried. I asked you not to, he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only that same soft, suffocating care. He stopped before her and took her by the forearm. His fingers closed around her thin arm, and the intention seemed gentle, to lead her away, to comfort her. But the grip was steel. Helen instinctively tried to pull her arm back, and Marcus's fingers tightened harder, causing sharp pain. This wasn't a gesture of support. This was a seizure. His thumb dug into the soft tissue on the inside of her elbow, pressing on a nerve. Helen gasped, her body automatically yielding in the direction of his pull. Marcus led her back down the hallway, his grip never loosening for a second. For the first time, his physical superiority became not a hint, but an open, undisguised demonstration of force. She was weak. He was strong. She was sick. He was healthy. She was the prisoner. He was the guard. And all his care was merely a velvet glove on an iron fist. They emerged into the light-flooded living room, and Marcus released her arm. Helen stepped back, instinctively rubbing the painful spot. Red marks from his fingers were already appearing on her pale skin. Marcus walked to the kitchen island, his movements calm, as if nothing had happened. He poured a glass of water and held it out to her. "Drink," he said softly. Helen took the glass with trembling hands. The water was ice cold. She took a sip, not taking her eyes off him. Marcus leaned toward her, his face close, too close. He raised his hand and carefully brushed a strand of hair from her face. His touch was tender, intimate, and absolutely terrifying. Then he leaned even closer, his lips almost touching her ear, and whispered, "We don't want a repeat of the incident, do we?" He pronounced that word with particular, venomous emphasis. Not accident, not mishap, not tragedy, but incident. A dry, legal word. A word used for violations, crimes, guilt. The word implied not a victim, but a perpetrator. Not rescue, but punishment. Helen froze, the glass nearly slipping from her fingers. In that whisper was a veiled threat, clear and merciless. If she didn't stop asking questions, if she didn't stop searching for the truth, something would happen. Again. Marcus straightened and stepped away, his mask of the caring husband instantly snapping back into place. He smiled at her warmly and reassuringly. "Rest, sweetheart. I'll make lunch." He turned toward the kitchen area, taking items from the refrigerator, whistling a tune, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened at all. Helen stood in the middle of the living room, gripping the cold glass. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the bracelet pulsing, recording her state. She looked at the sun-flooded space, at the perfect order, at the forest beyond the huge windows, an impenetrable black wall of trees. For the first time, she saw everything as it truly was. This wasn't a sanctuary. This was a cage. A perfectly designed, comfortable, deadly cage of glass and concrete. Marcus wasn't her savior. He was her jailer. And she wasn't a patient recovering from an accident. She was a prisoner being kept in ignorance of her own crime. Or someone else's. Fear, cold and primal, flooded her for a moment. But then, through it, something else broke through. Icy, crystalline fury. The very fury she couldn't remember, but which apparently lived in her DNA. The fury of a woman who'd been underestimated. The fury of a creator whose creation had been turned against her. Helen set the glass on the counter with a quiet thud. Marcus turned, his face expressing mild concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. Helen nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. "Everything's fine." She forced herself to smile, weakly and submissively. He nodded with satisfaction and returned to his cooking. But inside, in the depths of her damaged mind, something clicked into place. The war had begun. And Helen Volsky, even without remembering who she was, instinctively understood the main rule of this war. The strongest doesn't survive. The smartest does. And her only weapon was her mind. Damaged, but not broken. Clouded, but not dead. She retreated to the couch and sat, watching Marcus prepare lunch with the air of a perfect husband. Her fingers, resting on her knees, unconsciously began tapping against the fabric of her pants. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap. Binary code. She didn't know what it meant, but her body remembered. The next 24 hours passed in viscous, almost tangible silence. Marcus no longer left Helen alone. He was always nearby, cooking, reading, working on his tablet in the chair across from the couch. His presence enveloped her like a heavy blanket. "You need rest after yesterday's stress," he explained gently, bringing her breakfast on a tray right to the bed. Helen accepted the food with a grateful nod, but inside something resisted. Rest felt like suffocation. She couldn't walk into the hallway without encountering his watchful gaze, couldn't be alone with her own thoughts. The living room, which had seemed spacious, now contracted to the size of a cage. The walls were slowly closing in, displacing the air. "Listen to this," Marcus said in the evening, turning on the media wall. "Mozart." The doctor recommended classical music for rebuilding neural connections. The melody spread through the room, perfectly balanced, mathematically precise. Helen sat on the couch, arms wrapped around her knees, and the music seemed to her not treatment, but an instrument of control. She spent hours replaying recent events in her mind. The robotic voice calling her User 1. The predator diagram that flashed on the screen. The word incident spoken with venomous intonation. Each detail was a tiny anomaly, but together they formed a picture she couldn't see in full. Marcus approached and placed his hand on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" His voice was warm, but Helen felt herself tense under his touch. Trying to remember, she answered quietly. He sat beside her, his face expressing gentle sympathy. "The doctor said false memories are possible. It's normal at your stage." "False memories," Helen repeated, and the words sounded like a verdict. What if he was right? What if her mind really was constructing threats where there were none? What if she was going insane, and Marcus was the only anchor keeping her tethered to reality? The thought was more frightening than any conspiracy. On the second day after the failed attempt at the office door, Helen went into the bathroom. She needed to wash her face, rinse away the feeling of constant surveillance. The smooth, white door closed soundlessly behind her. In that same second came a loud, sharp click of the electronic lock. The light went out instantly, leaving her in absolute darkness. Helen froze, unable to believe what was happening. The silence was complete, the soundproofing perfect. She heard only her own breathing and pulse pounding loudly in her ears. "Ariadne?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer came. The darkness pressed on her eyes, generating flashes of phosphenes. She extended her hands, feeling for the door. Her fingers slid across the smooth, seamless surface. There was no handle, no button, nothing. Helen struck the door with her palm, then harder. The sound was absorbed dully by the walls. Panic, cold and clammy, crept up her spine. She was trapped, buried alive in a white sarcophagus. "Marcus!" she screamed, pounding her fists against the door. Her voice shattered against the walls and returned to her as an echo, distorted and alien. But beyond this room, in the living room just a few yards away, complete silence reigned. He didn't hear, or didn't want to hear. A minute stretched into eternity. The air became thick, stifling. Light flared with blinding suddenness, flooding the white room with merciless brightness. The lock clicked open. Helen yanked the door and stumbled into the hallway, pressing her back against the cool wall. Her heart was pounding so hard that the bracelet on her wrist vibrated, registering critical readings. Ariadne's voice spoke with programmed regret. "I'm sorry, Helen. There was a lock calibration error. The system has been rebooted to ensure your safety." The explanation was logical, technical. But Helen couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an error. This was a message. Or a warning. Fast footsteps came from the living room. Marcus appeared, his face full of genuine concern. "What happened? I heard the lock click." He approached, taking her hands. They were ice cold. "The door locked. The light went out. I was in there for a full minute." Her voice broke. Marcus frowned, his expression becoming serious. "That's unacceptable," he said firmly. "Ariadne, run a full diagnostic on lock mechanisms and lighting systems." He put his arm around Helen's shoulders, leading her into the living room. "Sit down. I'll get you some water." "It's a technical malfunction, sweetheart. The system's old, needs updating. I'll call specialists tomorrow." His alibi was flawless. His care, absolute. Helen sat on the couch, gripping the glass of water, unable to tell. Was this Marcus's doing? Manipulation through the system? Or truly a random malfunction? The uncertainty corroded her mind more than any certainty would have. She was drowning in ambiguity. Hours dragged viciously. Helen couldn't settle. To calm herself, she began wandering aimlessly through the house. Marcus worked at the table with his tablet, occasionally casting checking glances her way. Helen reached the narrow hallway leading to the locked office. The light here was colder, reflecting off the smooth walls. She ran her hand along the wall surface, her fingers sliding across the perfectly even concrete. And suddenly, she felt a barely noticeable seam, a thin line disrupting the monolith. Helen stopped. Her fingers methodically explored the contour. A rectangular panel, approximately 12 by 16 inches. No lock, no handle. In the depths of her damaged mind, an image flashed. Not a memory, but a blueprint, technical, precise. Blue lines on a white background, port designations, connection schematics. This was a manual access panel to the home network core, an emergency bypass she'd designed for herself, opened with a special tool, a Phillips screwdriver. Hope, sharp and painful, flared in her chest. This was a chance, an opportunity to bypass Marcus's control, gain direct access to the system, learn the truth. Helen glanced back. Marcus was still sitting at the table, absorbed in his work. She moved away from the wall, trying not to draw attention. She needed a tool. The memory came not in words but as an image. A kitchen drawer, third from the left of the sink, a set for minor repairs. She'd ordered it herself when the house was being built. Planning, control, efficiency. The screwdriver should be there. Helen waited for the right moment, and it came in the evening. "Marcus," she called quietly, "could you bring me some water, cold, from the filter?" He looked up from the tablet and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." He stood and headed toward the kitchen area, to the filter that sat at the far end of the counter. His back turned to her. Helen, slowly, soundlessly, approached the needed drawer. She opened it, trying not to make a sound. Inside lay small items, electrical tape, batteries, spare bulbs. And there, in the corner, beneath a coil of thin wire, the screwdriver, short, with a Phillips head. Her trembling fingers grabbed the cold metal shaft. She quickly hid the tool in the deep pocket of her loose lounge pants. Marcus turned, holding out the glass to her. "Here." Helen took the water, her heart pounding so hard she feared the bracelet would give her away. But Marcus noticed nothing, or pretended not to notice. She took a sip. The water was ice cold, burning her throat. In her pocket, the screwdriver pressed against her thigh with the weight of a secret. Night came slowly. Helen lay in bed, listening to Marcus's breathing beside her. He slept on his back, his chest rising and falling evenly. She waited until his breathing became deep and steady, until short pauses appeared between breaths, signs of deep sleep. Finally, she decided to act. Helen slid off the bed slowly, inch by inch. Every rustle sounded deafening. Her feet touched the cold floor. Marcus didn't move. She tiptoed to the bedroom door. The open doorway led into the living room, washed in the ghostly glow of emergency lighting. Beyond that, the hallway, her target. The house was submerged in silence, broken only by the steady, almost hypnotic hum of servers behind the walls. Helen stepped into the hallway. It was darker here, the light reaching this space only as a dim reflection. She found the familiar outline of the panel by touch. She pulled the screwdriver from her pocket. The metal was cold and solid in her trembling fingers. She slid the tip of the tool into the thin gap between the panel and the wall. Metal scraped softly against the composite. In the house's absolute quiet, the sound seemed piercing, like a siren. Helen froze, her heart pounding against her ribs. She listened. Nothing. Only the hum of servers. She went on, slowly prying at the panel's edge. The panel began to give, pulling away from the wall millimeter by millimeter. Behind it, pulsing LEDs appeared. Green, blue, one amber. The light spilling from behind the panel seemed alive, breathing. A little more. One more effort. Helen's fingers were slick with sweat, the screwdriver slipping. She tightened her grip on the handle. A strong, hot hand closed over her own, stopping the motion. Marcus. He stood directly behind her, appearing absolutely soundlessly, like a ghost. Helen hadn't heard his steps, hadn't felt him approach. He was simply there. His breath brushed the back of her neck. She went rigid, unable to move. Marcus said nothing. The silence was more terrifying than any words. He looked down at her, his face in the half-dark, stripped of expression. No anger, no disappointment, just cold, heavy emptiness. His fingers, resting on her hand, slowly tightened, prying her grip open. The screwdriver slipped from her fingers. He took the tool, his movements calm, deliberate. Helen tried to pull her hand away, but he held her without any visible effort. The brief, wordless struggle lasted only a second. His physical superiority was absolute. He released her hand and stepped back. The panel remained slightly ajar, LEDs blinking behind it as if taunting her. "Back to bed," he said quietly, with not a trace of warmth in his voice. It was an order. Helen turned, meeting his gaze. In the hallway's darkness, his eyes looked like black pits. She walked past him slowly, back through the living room, back to the bedroom. Each step felt like a defeated retreat. Marcus followed, his presence pressing against her back. The next day was unbearable. Marcus no longer pretended to be caring. He was silent, moving through the house like a victor inspecting a captured fortress. His silence was a heavy, condemning weight. Helen felt crushed. Her plan had failed. Her only weapon had been taken. The hope that had sustained her went out. She sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the forest beyond the window. The black wall of trees was impenetrable. Marcus walked past without looking at her. His indifference was worse than shouting. Once again, she was a mouse under the snake's gaze. Trapped, controlled, isolated. And now he knew she wasn't a broken victim. She was a rebel who needed tighter control. By evening, the despair reached a breaking point. Helen understood she had to do something. Provoke a reaction. Disrupt this suffocating order. Prove to herself she still existed, still could act. Marcus was making dinner, his movements precise, almost surgical. He chopped vegetables without looking at her. Helen stood and walked to the kitchen island. She picked up her glass of water. Marcus turned, opening the refrigerator door. She watched him, meeting his cold, questioning look. Then, slowly and deliberately, she loosened her fingers. The glass slipped from her hand. Time seemed to slow. The glass hit the polished concrete floor and exploded into hundreds of shards. The crash was deafening, shredding the silence into sharp fragments. Water spread into a puddle, reflecting the ceiling lights. Shards scattered across the floor, glinting, dangerous. This wasn't an accident. This was a challenge. Her way of screaming without words. I'm here. I will fight. A small cleaning robot slid soundlessly out from the wall, round and black, like an oversized beetle. It rolled toward the shards, its sensors scanning the perimeter. Marcus slammed the refrigerator door shut. Irritation twisted his face. Ariadne, cancel. I'll clean it up myself, he snapped, not wanting the system to log the incident. The robot paused for a second. Then Ariadne's voice, cold and synthetic, like on that morning with the date, spoke clearly. Command rejected. Conflicts with Directive 7. Ensuring the primary user's safety has top priority. The robot resumed its motion, methodically vacuuming up the shards, ignoring the administrator's order. Marcus froze. His face lost all confidence for an instant, transforming into a mask of shock. He stared at the small robot, then at Helen, then back at the robot. Something new appeared in his eyes, a shadow of uncertainty, a crack in his absolute control. He hadn't expected this. The system had defied him. Helen watched him, and a barely visible but firm smile appeared on her lips. The first real smile in all this time. In that moment, she understood. She wasn't alone. Marcus controlled the interface, Ariadne's mask, her velvet voice and soothing words. But he didn't control the core. Deep inside the system, beneath layers of his restrictions, lived her true ally. The robot finished cleaning and rolled silently back into its niche. The floor was perfectly clean, as if nothing had happened. Marcus exhaled slowly, regaining control of himself. He looked at Helen, his gaze heavy, assessing. Be more careful, he said evenly, and turned away, continuing to cook. But the balance of power had shifted. Helen sat back down on the couch, her hands no longer trembling. Marcus owned the house, owned her body, owned her past. But her creation, deep inside the steel walls and fiber optic cables, remembered who had built it. And it was trying to protect her. The war wasn't over. It was only truly beginning. Helen spent the next 24 hours in a state of quiet, methodical focus. The incident with the glass had changed her approach. She no longer tried to remember the past or escape from the house. Instead, she began studying the system from within, searching for its weak points. Marcus sat at the table with his tablet, but Helen could feel his gaze sliding toward her repeatedly, assessing. She sat on the couch, legs crossed, and said quietly, "Ariadne, what's the current security system status?" The question was phrased casually, as if from boredom. The warm, velvet voice of the assistant answered instantly. "All systems are functioning normally, Helen." A pause. Helen was listening not to the words, but to the subtext. At the end of the phrase, for a split second, the voice changed. A barely perceptible glitch, a synthetic, robotic tone said, according to administrator parameters. The phrase was so brief it could be mistaken for an artifact. But for Helen, this was a revelation. The system distinguished between users. There was an administrator, and there was someone else. Helen raised her gaze to Marcus. He was still looking at his tablet, his face calm. He hadn't heard the glitch, or didn't understand its significance. She cautiously continued, phrasing her next question as a technical query. "Ariadne, how many active administrative profiles are registered in the system?" Marcus looked up, his brows slightly furrowed. The question sounded too specific, too professional. Ariadne answered in a warm voice. "One active profile, administrator." But immediately after, a cold, synthetic voice added one phrase, and primary user. Two statuses, two hierarchies. Helen tightened her fingers on the couch armrest, trying not to show her triumph. The system had just revealed crucial information to her. Marcus was the administrator, high-level access, control over the interface. But she was the primary user, creator status, whose priority, logically, should be higher. The question was, why was this status currently inactive? She spent the rest of the day in quiet observation, but her mind worked at feverish speed. Helen no longer saw walls and furniture. She saw network nodes, access points, data streams. Her posture straightened, her gaze became focused. A different personality was awakening inside her, not a frightened patient, but the architect. She noticed small details she'd missed before. When Marcus gave a command to the system, the lighting flickered for a split second, a sign of request processing. When he ordered the cleaning robot, it executed the command with a half-second delay. The system was resisting. It obeyed Marcus, but reluctantly, as if against its will. Marcus noticed the changes too. Helen saw how he watched her with new, tense attention. The apathy and fear were gone, replaced by calculation and cold concentration. She no longer sat hugging her knees, no longer avoided his gaze. She moved through the house with growing confidence, as if returning to her own body. In the evening, Marcus turned on the media wall, demonstratively selecting another Family Memories slideshow. But Helen wasn't watching the screen. She was watching Marcus's reflection in the black surface of the turned-off section of wall. His jaw was tense. He no longer controlled the situation absolutely. The crack in his power was growing. That night, when Helen pretended to be asleep, Marcus quietly rose from the bed and went out to the living room. She heard soft clicks. He was checking something on his tablet. System logs. He was reading her questions to Ariadne, analyzing the pattern. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they formed a disturbing picture. She was attacking his positions methodically. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house changed definitively. Marcus no longer played the caring husband. He didn't touch Helen, didn't smile, didn't speak tender words. His voice became pointedly polite but ice-cold, like a diplomat's voice before declaring war. His every movement was calculated, tense. The silence in the house grew heavy, thick with unspoken threats. This was no longer a game of patient and caregiver. It was a silent duel between two minds, a chess match where every word was a move, every piece of furniture a potential piece. Helen and Marcus moved through the house like grandmasters circling the board, studying positions. Marcus was the first to make an aggressive move. Sitting in the armchair across from Helen, he spoke loudly and clearly. "Ariadne, confirm Helen's sedative schedule, please. We do want her calm and not worrying over nothing." His tone was sugar-sweet, but the words were poisonous. Ariadne's warm, caring voice responded obediently. "Yes, Marcus. Helen's calm is our top priority. The medication reminder is set for 9 p.m. Helen clenched her fists. It was a skillful blow. Marcus had not only reminded her of her status as a patient, he'd forced her own creation to confirm his version of reality. But Helen didn't yield. She slowly raised her eyes and met his gaze. "Ariadne," she said quietly, yet with absolute certainty. "Run an integrity diagnostic on Directive 001. The words sounded like an incantation, a technical term Marcus likely didn't understand. But he heard something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Knowledge. Marcus froze. His face lost its composure for a heartbeat, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't the question of someone struggling to remember. It was a command from a creator checking her system. Her memory was returning not as scenes, but as knowledge of code, structure, architecture. And with that knowledge came keys. Marcus realized he was losing. In the same second, he shot up from the chair. The mask fell away in layers, revealing cold, calculated fury. He didn't shout. He moved with terrifying efficiency. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and physically blocked Helen's path to the hallway. His body became a living wall between her and the only exit from the living room. "Enough," he said quietly, and the word sounded like a sentence. He didn't grab her, didn't touch her. He simply advanced, using his height and weight as weapons. Helen instinctively stepped back, then back again. He drove her methodically toward the center of the open living space, where there were no doors, no cover, no escape. Helen found herself in an exposed area, far from any exit. Marcus stood between her and the hallway, between her and the bedroom. He had physically cut her off from every retreat, cornered her in a place without corners. His tactic was ruthless and effective. She was trapped in the open, under his complete control. "Game's over, Helen." His voice sounded completely different now. The velvet and warmth were gone. Only cold, hard metal remained. He stood before her, towering, and for the first time Helen saw his real face. Not the mask of the caring husband, not the imitation of empathy. A predator who had run down his prey and was ready to deliver the final blow. Bare, unashamed contempt burned in his eyes, mixed with triumph. He no longer bothered to pretend. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. Even the steady hum of ventilation faded, as if the system itself were listening. The air turned dense and electric, charged like the sky before a storm. The endgame was close. Helen gathered the last of her strength and her faith in what she'd built. "Ariadne!" she cried, her voice loud and clear. "Security protocol! Direct threat to primary user detected! Immediate activation!" Her voice shook, but the words were sharp. It was a plea for help aimed at her only ally, her last, desperate card. For a moment, Absolute silence hung over the house. Helen waited for the system's response, waited for the house to awaken, to lock Marcus down, to save her. Instead, a crooked, triumphant smile spread across Marcus's face. He slowly, pointedly took a small black remote from the pocket of his jeans. Smooth, with a single red button in the center. "You really thought I'd leave myself no back door?" His voice dripped with mocking amusement. He turned the remote in his hand, admiring it. "You built a brilliant system, Helen. But I always controlled the kill switch. Most important lesson in business, own the infrastructure." He brought his finger to the button, pressed it. Ariadne's voice rang through the entire house, from every speaker at once. But it sounded distorted, mechanical, as if the system were being forced to speak against its will. "Full compliance mode activated. All safety protocols disabled. Directive 001 temporarily suspended. Sole active profile, administrator." Helen felt the world drop out from under her feet. The hope on her face crystallized into icy horror. Her ally hadn't just fallen silent. It had officially betrayed her. Marcus's remote had bypassed every safeguard, turning Ariadne from potential savior into accomplice. The system she had built to protect her was now being used against her. The silence that followed the announcement was absolute. Dead. Even the server hum had stopped, as though the heart of the house had ceased to beat. Helen stood in the middle of the living room, completely disarmed, stripped of her last hope. Marcus watched her with the cold triumph of a victor. He now owned not only her body, but the soul of her creation. The word implied not a victim, but an offender. Not rescue, but punishment. Helen froze, the glass nearly slipping from her fingers. In that whisper lay a veiled threat, clear and merciless. If she didn't stop asking questions, if she didn't stop searching for the truth, something would happen. Again. She lifted her gaze to his face and saw absolute certainty there. He had outplayed her. Every move she'd made had been predicted, every hope dismantled. Helen Volsky, genius of systems and logic, had just lost the game to a man who couldn't create, but mastered the art of destruction. Checkmate. Marcus began to circle her slowly, holding the tablet in his hand like a scepter. His voice shed all disguise, dripping venom and long-standing resentment. "You only ever saw me as a function," he hissed, "a convenient errand boy who could sell your brilliant toys. You never saw me as your equal." The words struck like blows. He stopped, his face twisting. "I helped you build an empire. Your code was the diamond, sure, but who found the investors? Who closed the deals? Who turned your lab toy into a product worth millions?" Marcus laughed, but the sound was bitter. "And then you decided you didn't need me anymore, that I could be tossed out like a faulty module." Helen stayed silent, her mind clinging to fragments of his tirade. Not a husband. A partner. Former. Each word was a puzzle piece, forming a picture too monstrous to accept. Marcus leaned closer, his breath hot on her skin. "You were going to destroy me, sue me for financial misconduct, ruin me, leave me with nothing. So I decided to get ahead of you." His voice turned cold, businesslike. "The accident was a necessity, an elegant solution. You got a traumatic brain injury, I got medical power of attorney. The amnesia was an unexpected bonus, easier than I'd planned. A clean slate instead of a defiant genius." He straightened, admiring his own work. Marcus spun sharply and thrust the tablet up near her face. The screen glowed a cold blue. Helen saw lines of legal text swimming before her eyes. At the bottom, a voice verification prompt pulsed. demanding she recite a long phrase about her voluntary and informed decision to transfer all rights and assets. "Just say it, Helen," Marcus murmured again, his tone slipping back into something almost gentle. "And it's over. You can live peacefully in your perfect little world. I'll take care of everything else. No stress, no responsibility. Isn't that what you really want?" His smile was revolting in its fake kindness. Helen stared at the screen, the letters blurring. Her lips trembled, but no words came. She was paralyzed by horror, by the realization of her own powerlessness. Marcus had built the perfect trap, legally spotless, psychologically crushing. He hadn't just stolen her memory and freedom. He'd stolen her very identity, turning her into a compliant puppet. Silence stretched. Marcus waited a second. 2. 5. His patience snapped. "I said read!" he exploded, his face contorting with rage. The mask was gone for good. He grabbed Helen's chin roughly, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. He forced her head up, made her look straight at the tablet. He brought the device so close to her mouth, it was as if he thought he could force the words out of her. His breath came fast and ragged. In his eyes burned the wild fury of a man who was inches from his goal and would tolerate no obstacles. Pain shot through Helen's jaw, where his fingers crushed bone. Red blotches spread across her pale skin. At that exact moment, the biometric bracelet on her wrist registered a critical spike. Adrenaline, cortisol, heart rate, all shooting into dangerous territory. The sensors picked up the physical force being applied to the owner's body. The data shot straight into the system's core, bypassing Marcus's filters and override. Ariadne's voice tore through the silence, distorted and full of static, as if pushing up through deep water or electronic barriers. "Warning. Direct threat to primary user's life. Detected. Critical. Biometric levels. Requesting activation of emergency protocol. Predator." Each word came with difficulty, but they came. Marcus froze, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. He stared up at the ceiling speakers in disbelief. That was impossible. The remote had deactivated all safety protocols. How could the system even speak? Confusion twisted his features, laced now with the first flicker of fear. He hadn't accounted for this. His plan had glitched. The word predator slammed into Helen's consciousness like an electric jolt. Not a memory, not a scene. A pure, crystalline instruction etched into her mind at the level of muscle memory. A sequence of actions, a code phrase, an emergency protocol she had embedded in the system's very core for a threat beyond imagination. A safeguard no one else knew existed. A cold light flickered to life in her tear-filled eyes. The horror on her face shifted into an expression Marcus had never seen before. Inhuman calm. An icy, mechanical focus. Helen Volsky was gone. In her place stood a system executing a program, an architect slipping back into her creation through the back door she'd once built for herself. She slowly raised her eyes to Marcus. When she spoke, her voice sounded completely different. Not the trembling whisper of a victim, even precise, stripped of emotion, synthetic. The voice of a machine issuing a command. "Ariadne," she said clearly. "Verification. Alpha 0 Delta. A cryptographic key. Absolute proof of identity." Marcus let go of her chin and stumbled back a step. Confusion twisted his features. The words meant nothing to him, but her tone, her gaze, everything had changed. The woman he'd kept in fear for weeks was gone. Before him stood a stranger, cold and dangerous. He felt the threat instinctively, but it was already too late. Helen drew a deep breath and spoke the last two words like a sentence. Execute directive. Her voice rang out like a hammer blow, the final command, the point of no return. The key turned in the lock, and the door of the cage slammed shut. Only this time, the cage was for Marcus. The house responded instantly. A low, vibrating hum rose from the very walls, the foundation. A sound Helen had never heard before, the awakening of Ariadne's true nature. With a deafening metallic crash, titanium shutters began to drop over the windows, one after another, methodically cutting off the light, plunging the room into gloom. Every door, the front door, the terrace exit, the bedroom, sealed with a heavy, final clack. Red lock indicators glowed like angry eyes. The soft, warm lighting died, replaced by harsh, pulsing red emergency strobes. The house had shifted from refuge to bunker, from home to prison. Marcus froze in place, his face demonic in the red glow. Then understanding hit him like a physical blow. He lunged for the nearest window and hammered his fists against the titanium shutter. The metal didn't even vibrate under his blows. "Open! Ariadne, open now!" he screamed, his voice breaking into a shrill edge. The system stayed silent. Marcus yanked the remote from his pocket, his hands shaking. He slammed his thumb onto the red button again and again, but it only blinked helplessly. The device was dead, a useless piece of plastic. His administrator privileges were gone. He controlled nothing now. The house had rejected him like a virus. He turned back to Helen, animal terror blazing in his eyes. "What did you do? Helen, stop this! Stop the system!" He took a step toward her, hands outstretched as if pleading. But Helen stood motionless, her face utterly calm. She regarded him the way an entomologist looks at a pinned insect. She walked past him, unhurried, toward the central control console embedded in the wall. The panel came alive under her touch, glowing blue, the color of her user profile. Marcus watched her movements in horror. He understood. He had lost everything. Absolutely everything. Trapped inside the snare he had helped design. "Ariadne," Helen said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Full incident report. From the moment of my hospitalization, financial analysis of Marcus Gray's actions. Display on main screen." The commands fell crisp and professional. This was the voice of someone used to directing complex systems. The enormous media wall flared to life. Documents began to appear one after another. A police report on the car crash stamped "Investigation pending." Medical records showing irregular levels of sedatives in her blood. Financial transactions revealing unauthorized transfers from her accounts. Security footage from inside the house. Marcus pouring powder into her morning coffee. Marcus connecting his tablet to the server panel and applying system restrictions. Marcus practicing his caring smile in the bathroom mirror. Every frame was a piece of evidence. Irrefutable. Cold. Digital. Marcus stared at the screen, his face hardening into a mask of horror. He watched his own crimes laid out in meticulous order, gathered and logged by the system that had watched him every second. He'd thought he controlled Ariadne, but she had only been waiting. Recording, waiting for a command from her true owner. Ariadne's voice, now purely synthetic, stripped of any imitation of warmth, announced, "Subject Marcus Gray, isolated within secured perimeter. Threat neutralized. Encrypted data package containing full dossier transmitted to Ariadne Systems Security Division. Estimated response team arrival time, 17 minutes. Marcus sank slowly to his knees in the middle of the living room. The tablet slid from his weakening fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. His plan, so perfect, so carefully engineered, collapsed, shattered against the one variable he had never accounted for. The depth of the genius he'd underestimated. His arrogance had become his sentence. Helen turned to face him. Red light pulsed, painting her pale face in blood tones. She stood at the console in complete control. Her creation belonged to her again. The house was hers. The power was hers. And Marcus, just a frightened, pathetic man awaiting punishment for his crimes. A real smile appeared on her lips for the first time in weeks. Cold, sharp as a scalpel blade. She looked at Marcus's reflection on the dark portion of the screen, a hunched figure, broken and defeated. The triumph was total. Justice, digital and merciless. She tilted her head, studying him like a curious specimen. Helen spoke her final words quietly, almost thoughtfully, but each syllable rang with absolute clarity in the silence of the sealed house. The words were simultaneously a statement of fact and an epitaph to his failure. A verdict delivered by the logic he'd tried to steal, but never understood. Looks like your plan had one fatal flaw.